Welcome to Liberty Me's interview series, The Charming Offensive. I am your host, Tiffany Madison, and today I will be speaking with Michael Lotfi, a former medical student turned political advisor and columnist for The Washington Times and Ben Swath's Truth in Media Project. Michael is also the Executive State Director for the Tennessee 10th Amendment Center. Thank you for joining me today, Michael.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to chat with you because your activism is both inspiring and very principled, and I'm sure you'll agree we live in very interesting times. And between the Tea Party movement and Occupy movement, and now recently the burgeoning Liberty movement, inspired by Dr. Paul, it seems that Americans are more politically engaged than ever. And one way that they're engaged is through the nullification activism process, something that you're very familiar with. And their efforts are on the rise. And I know those secession petitions were kind of a exercise in protest, but between marijuana and marriage and gun control, Obamacare, Common Core, it seems like those efforts are on the rise. How have these pushbacks surprised you, and what do you think is the root cause?
I think if there is a root cause, it's just a gross lack of understanding between the difference of principles and values. The pushback comes from Democrats and Republicans, but it just depends on which issue it is that we're discussing. So what's really fascinating is that Republicans are, more than willing most of the time, or some of the time, to at least entertain the idea of nullifying, Obama's gun control or Obamacare or Common Core or the EPA or these other things. And then all of a sudden, if in that same conversation, a Democrat would turn around and say, well, okay, then, we're going to nullify, a federal gay marriage law or the federal ban on marijuana. Then all of a sudden, Republicans will act like they have no idea what you're even talking about. What do you mean nullification? Or you can't do that. Or, well, the government, if that's the federal government, they're allowed to do that, And then the inverse is true as well. If you have states like Colorado or Washington who have fought back against the federal government on marijuana, and they may not want to call it nullification, but that's essentially what they're doing. They're disregarding the federal law on the basis of the fact that the states are delegated this power. So, the liberal states, obviously, they can call it whatever they want to, but regardless, they're nullifying the federal law with regards to marijuana. And then all of a sudden, if a Republican in that same state says, well, okay, well, we're going to nullify, Obamacare or federal gun laws, etc., then all of a sudden they're like, well, what do you mean? You can't do that. That's a part of the, the federal government's law. You can't, there's the supremacy clause and all of these things. So, like I said, it just depends on the issue of whether or not they want to actually agree with the fact that you have to listen to every single thing the federal government says, which to me just illustrates a gross lack of understanding between principles and values. Because if you look at all these issues, they're values issues. Should the federal government be able to legislate, marijuana or gay marriage, et cetera, et cetera? Well, these are all like, buzzword values that, we talk about. But in reality, the principle, is to actually look at the Constitution and say, Article 1, Section 8 delegates less than 24 powers to the federal government. Is marijuana, gay marriage, EPA, Obamacare, any of these things, are they actually in the Constitution as it is written? The answer, of course, is no. And so when you take the principled approach, you will find that you can usually make common ground with people because you say, well, I'm a conservative and I don't agree with, marijuana or gay marriage or whatever it is. And, I'm going to go ahead and say, well, the federal government shouldn't be doing that, because when the federal government does that, that allows them to then bring in Common Core or the EPA or Obamacare. And so if you can approach these things from a principled perspective, then you have a very effective argument with Democrats and Republicans, because you can turn their argument against themselves. But like I said, the problem is that no one wants to talk about principles. They want to talk about their own issue, which 9 times out of 10 is a values issue and not an actual principle issue.
Yeah, one of those big efforts I've noticed, and something that you're very passionate about, is Obamacare. And my second question concerns the open letter that you wrote that went near viral. And in that letter, you announced your resignation from medical school due to Obamacare's devastating impact on the medical profession. Since SCOTUS has ruled on the ACA's alleged constitutionality, this disastrous program has been fraught with failure. What do you think is the future, and how, are we actually going to see that implemented, or do you think you're going to see more pushback?
Well, unfortunately, Obamacare is here to stay. It's certainly not going away, because even the Republicans on the federal level who say they're against Obamacare, there's only probably 3 or 4, maybe there's definitely less than a dozen, split between the Senate and the House, that actually truly want to defund Obamacare 100%. Now, you see this, then they give this question. They say, well, okay, well, if Obamacare is so bad, then what's your solution? That's the Democrats, rebuttal to the Republican who says that they want to end Obamacare. Well, then they say, well, we're going to give our own plan, or, well, this is what our plan is, or, Romney care, whatever care. So Obamacare isn't going anywhere. It may change names to, John McCain care, or, whatever it is, but the federal takeover is here to stay. Now, of course, the states obviously have the right to fight back, whether they use nullification or they use anti-commandeering doctrine to effectively say that, in the state of Tennessee, for example, where you and I are, the state of Tennessee is not going to provide any material support whatsoever. Anyone who contracts with the state of Tennessee cannot contract, with the federal government on healthcare legislation. All state agencies and political divisions of the state of Tennessee cannot assist to implement the federal healthcare law in any way whatsoever. So this is anti-commandeering doctrine, and that's actually a 100% legal maneuver to take. The Supreme Court itself has handed this down over 180 years on 4 separate Supreme Court cases, and one of those cases actually in and of itself was the Obamacare case, NFIB versus Sebelius. In this very case, a lot of people say, oh, well, they found Obamacare constitutional, Well, number one, they didn't find Obamacare constitutional. What they actually did was redefine the law. They legislated from the bench. So Obamacare in and of itself was actually not constitutional. The Supreme Court changed Obamacare to make it constitutional. What they also did, though, was they said that the states cannot be coerced or commandeered in any way whatsoever to implement the law. And this goes with all federal laws, whether it's a constitutional law or unconstitutional law. Any federal law, no matter how constitutional it is, the states have the ability to say, in this state, we are not going to fund that law. We're not giving you any assistance. No buildings, no electricity, no water, no utilities, no state employees, etc., to be a part of this. Now, what that does is it sets up this paradigm. And a lot of people say, oh, the federal government's so big, they have limitless supplies. That's actually not true. They are certainly limited. And so if 10, 15 states actually came in and passed anti-commandeering legislation, then the Obamacare legislation in and of itself would collapse, because there's no way. What it does is it requires the federal government to go into every state, set up offices, use resources, hire employees, etc., to actually implement the federal law. They can't afford to do that. And a perfect example is to look at Colorado's marijuana, industry. In the state of Colorado, if they were to pass, some sort of anti-commandeering legislation, or the federal government actually had to pay for 100% of the DEA's expenses to go into Colorado and eradicate the entire industry, it would take over 7 years of the DEA's entire budget just to take on that one state. So, sure, the feds have a lot of money, but they don't have limitless resources, and they actually can't afford to come in and do these things. So could you imagine in Colorado if they were to use anti-commandeering legislation on guns, Obamacare, the EPA, Common Core, and the the DEA for their marijuana industry, it would take decades of resources just in that one state for the feds to actually implement every federal law. A lot of people don't understand is that the states are actually working with the federal government, giving the federal government money, tax exemptions, or state employees are being used to do this. They're using the state's electricity, their infrastructure, their buildings, etc. And so, effectively, you put up an incredible barrier when you use this type of legislation that the Supreme Court itself has validated that we can use. The problem is even in the states, though, Republicans won't do it either. So if you go to any Republican's campaign website, obviously we're moving into campaign season, you go to any Republican's campaign website, they're going to tell you how bad Obamacare is and how much they hate Obamacare. And it's really fascinating, especially on the state level, because to hear a state legislator talk about it makes no sense really, because you say, okay, well, this is a federal law and you're a state, senator. So if you really don't believe that you can do anything as a state senator to Obamacare, then why the hell are you even talking about it? Because it's a buzzword and they know it's going to get them reelected. But the truth is that some of them know that as a state legislature, you do indeed have the power to stop federal laws within your state if you so choose to. However, it's a very, very small minority of Republicans that are actually willing to do it. And therefore, Obamacare is definitely here to stay, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a lack of willingness to nullify in general that I find very disappointing, and that actually brings me to my next question regarding your feud with Mark Levin, which I followed throughout its life and was very entertained. But for people who don't know, Mark Levin is a media establishment conservative commentator. He wrote a book called The Liberty Amendments: Restoring the American Republic, and it caught significant attention. And in this book, Levin proposes that an Article 5 constitutional convention is what is required to say what remains of the Constitution. And you publicly disagreed, stating that our federal government is lawless, supporting your argument with an entire list of treasonous acts, in my opinion. Additional amendments would do nothing to restore liberty. He wasn't happy with your well-reasoned arguments, and I have a theory, but I'm interested to hear what you think as to why a professed conservative like Levin would so enthusiastically discourage nullification, and why do you think he was fearful to debate you?
Well, the truth with Mark is that Mark wants to fancy himself a new founding father. And so what Mark's whole plan is, most likely, is to, obviously he's trying to start this movement, and he wants to be ringleader of the movement. I think, or I believe, that he's hoping that the history books will remember him as someone who started the movement and provided the legal representation for future amendments to the United States Constitution. So I think that's why Mark is so passionate about the amendment process and so unwilling to look at other options, because he's put all of his eggs in this basket. Now, if you actually know the history of Mark Levin, Mark was actually extremely anti-constitutional convention only a couple of years before he wrote his book. And then I guess he eventually caught wind that he could, make a lot of money off of this idea because it was starting to catch some steam, and he figured, I can be the ringleader of this. I have this massive outlet with all of these followers. So then all of a sudden he jumped ship. We may see him in 5 or 6 years jump ship and actually say that nullification is real too. But the point being is that, Mark has put all of his eggs in this basket, and the way to fix our government, it's for some reason has become this two dichotomies, either nullification or constitutional convention, and for some reason the two sides argue with one another. Now, I never personally attacked Mark. Mark came after us and has been going after us for a couple of years now, and he calls us crazy and that we're kooks and we have no idea what we're talking about. And then he uses logical fallacies, of course, all the time, and misinterprets what the founders actually said about nullification, purposely so, to mislead people. And so what I did in the article is I just perfectly laid out what the founders actually said and actually cited them. and cleared up this sort of ambiguity that he created, because there was a time where James Madison said that, we couldn't nullify this. And so what Mark Levin does is he says, well, Madison is saying that nullification is dumb, it's wrong in totality, there's no such thing, you can't do it. Well, what Mark was referencing was James Madison actually speaking about Vice President Calhoun at the time, who was trying to nullify an actual constitutional law. And James Madison said, well, this isn't what nullification is for, so no, you can't use nullification here. But Levin leaves that entire part out about that law actually being constitutional, and about Madison literally 6 or 7 lines down the page going on to confirm nullification is real. You can use nullification, et cetera, but not on this. So Levin leaves that whole part out of the history, of course. But I think, like I said, Levin just wants to be the ringleader of a movement, and if people are on board with nullification, then they may not be on board with the constitutional amendment process. Now, I'm not very, strongly so, oh, I hate the Constitutional Convention. I mean, that is something that's there in the Constitution. It's a process for us to use if we have to use it. But people are failing to ask this simple question, and it is the Constitution broken, or is the federal government lawless? And that's the question where we say, do we use a constitutional amendment, or do we need to nullify laws? And so, perfect example would be, slavery, if you will. So, slavery was written into the United States Constitution in its infancy. Now, we can look at that and say, well, this is wrong. This is bad. This is a defect within the Constitution that we need to fix. And so when you have that, that's when you actually have an amendment to the Constitution. Now, when the federal government is lawless and they're not listening to the Constitution in the first place, they're not following what it says, they use it as toilet paper in the White House, that's when you have to say, well, what does it matter if we amend it? They're just going to do the same thing a couple years down the road. These are Band-Aids. Sure, it may fix the problem for a couple years or so, but until what point does the Supreme Court then turn around and start to rewrite the laws like they have been doing, for the past 200 years or so? And so that's when we say, okay, well, clearly an amendment's not going to work because the government's not listening to what's there right now. So in this case, we need to have an actual nullification of the law.
Yeah, and that's speaking of lawlessness. I have 2 more questions for you. But you describe yourself as a Persian American, and we've discussed before on Facebook and interactions when the war drums were beating to attack Iran for the 5th or 6th time. And we've discussed the obsession that the chicken hawks and the warmongers in Washington have with annihilating and destroying Iran. Tensions have cooled for now, but what do you think is the root cause of their cries for war, and what can Iran do to calm those tensions?
Well, Iran is in the middle of a presidential change right now. Not that that necessarily means anything, because the regime is still the same. But the presidents are obviously changing right now, or have been for the past couple of years. So they're sort of resituating under that new presidency. But the issue is just how, the issue isn't necessarily Iran so much as it is America. And let's just be frank and honest. The issue here is the war lobby. They obviously, the war profiteers, they can't wait to drop the next bomb on whatever country it is. Now, that's not to say that Iran has not been an irresponsible country or is not doing things that are incredibly irresponsible. They certainly do. But at the same time, there is this constant need for America to put their nose where it doesn't belong so that we can beat the drums of war. A perfect example was a couple months ago to read all of the articles, and I'm sure anybody could Google it and it would still pop up. This idea that Iran was sending warships towards the American coast. Now, there's an old running joke in Iran. It goes, how do you sink an Iranian battleship? And you put it in water. I mean, It's that simple. These warships are literally uh, rust buckets with paint on them, if you could even afford the paint. There's no such thing as, this massive Iranian military that's some sort of real true threat. If America wanted to, they could take out the entire Iranian Navy fleet in a couple hours. But I honestly don't believe that there will be a war between America and Iran, simply because Iran is not Iraq, or Afghanistan. Those two countries are very different, and it comes down to sort of this Arab versus Persian, geoclimate sort of situation where you look at those countries, and people tend to believe that the Middle East in its entirety is just a desert with a bunch of people living in huts. But Iran is very similar to San Diego. I mean, if you go to San Diego, that's basically like being in Iran. So, in Tehran, explicitly the actual capital of Iran. So it's mountainous and gorgeous, and there's water, and there's skiing, and there's millions of people, and it's a very thriving metropolis. So whereas you had Iraq and Afghanistan, these countries have an economy 1/15 the size of Iran. So for America to actually start anything with Iran that would become a next war would truly be the next world war, because we're not talking Iraq or Afghanistan here. Iran is a massive country with a large economy, with a lot of resources. So it would be, we would have to be very ready, I guess you would say, to actually get into a war with Iran, because it would be huge. It would be massive. It would be nothing like the Iraq War, Afghanistan, or any of that stuff. I mean, a war with Iran would be 10, 15, 20 times larger. And I think the best thing that any of us can do right now, really and truly, is to use some diplomacy. America, we don't have to be the police of the world. And Iran needs to, really calculate the way that they speak and they interact, and everything else, and not make idle threats, because the government in Iran certainly has made idle threats. That's not a lie. That's perpetrated by the military-industrial complex. Iran is a country of all bark and no bite, essentially.
Right.
And America is a reactionary country that hears a bark and shoots a dog no matter what. So
That's actually a great analogy. One thing that I really do, and it would sink the global economy, and probably tank what's left of the dollar, but and send oil prices through the roof. And these are all consequences that I know our bureaucrats in Washington I hardly consider when they're on the podium screaming for all these conflicts. But and one thing that I hope will prevent us from getting into preventative wars as well is obviously the rising libertarian movement and this kind of conservatarian vibe that is soaking into the GOP. And this kind of brings me to my last question. So I know you describe yourself as a conservative, but you're very liberty-minded. And it's no secret that in 2016 it's going to be a very interesting period for the liberty movement inspired by Dr. Paul. It's going to be an interesting year for the GOP. And it's also no secret that establishment conservatives, Tea Party activists, what's left of them, and libertarians really struggle to cooperate within the GOP, especially either at the state level or when these conventions come around to nominate a president. Are there any policy initiatives, maybe the top policy initiative you think that could unite all of those factions?
that's a tough one, man. How do you even answer that? Yeah, I don't know if there is something that unites all of those fractions, except for maybe an economical perspective or a tax perspective. Guns typically would probably do it as well. But, anything else outside of that, no, I don't see much unity there. I call myself a conservatarian. I kind of think I did coin the phrase like a year and a half ago, and I've seen people start to use it, so I'm happy about that. But at the same time, I think what it takes is ruthless pragmatism, as Frank Underwood put it. you've got to be pragmatic. And what I really see the issue with a lot of libertarians is they are not pragmatic, and they're not willing to be pragmatic. And unfortunately, what you have is a lot of people who are like that. They've never spent a day at Legislative Plaza in D.C. or in their state or anywhere else. They don't understand the actual process and what it takes to actually make change happen. They truly don't understand. And I'm not trying to be demeaning or insulting to anyone, but I do see that a lot within the libertarian movement. And it was something that really actually pushed me away. I mean, if we're being completely honest, it's something that pushed me away from actually calling myself a libertarian, was just the complete lack of pragmatism that I found within the party. And like I said, I think you have to actually have spent time in the legislative process to understand what you're really dealing with. And I don't think that a lot of them have, or a lot of people in general, obviously, have never walked into their state capitol and have ever actually written a bill and got it sponsored and seen what happens to legislation as you move it down the committee process. And that's something that I've done, and so it has really awakened my eyes to actually understand what has to be done in the process that we have to use. So, you know, the truth be told, when I first got involved in politics and was very excited, I was the same way. I was very, I wasn't pragmatic. You know, I wanted change. I wanted it now. I wanted, you know, if a bill was going forward and it said that it was going to stop the NSA and it didn't stop the NSA by the time it passed, and then we passed the bill anyways and it only did, you know, even a 3/4 of what it was supposed to do, then, you know, I would get furious and upset, and, you know, we would, you know, protest these legislators and stuff. But then, you know, actually getting involved and taking legislation there and lobbying for it, I now see that if I could get a bill that did 3/4 of what I wanted it to do when I first started, then that would be magical. What you actually get is maybe 1/20th, if that, of what your bill actually set out to do. And so I look at the legislative process the same way I look at this cultural or sociocultural, you know, change within the libertarian movement and et cetera on a national level. I always tell people who get upset about these things or about what Rand Paul is doing or this or that, I always say, you know, communism, fascism, socialism, whatever ism you want to, you know, corporatism, whatever you want to call America, did not come here waving a red flag saying, vote for me. You know, it didn't happen overnight. And so there's no way that we're going to fix this overnight. We have to be ruthlessly pragmatic, and we have to take this one bite at a time. And so I think that if there's anything that, you know, would unite people and stop all of this bickering, it would be this idea of people understanding how to actually fight the fight. We're not fighting the fight correctly. You know, we're going to these protests and we're screaming our heads off and we're taking our loaded guns to D.C. and I understand the dissent and why we're unhappy and why we're pissed off. Trust me, I do. But on the other side of this, you have to understand you're not going to get anything done that way. And the only way to get things done is to, unfortunately, take this one bite at a time, and it may be, you know, 15, 20, 30 years before we actually get our country back. But it's either going to be that or, you know, an all-out violent revolution in the middle of the streets. And, you know, I think if libertarians are honest and true about their intentions to be, you know, nonviolent and etc., then you have to either say, we're going to be ruthlessly pragmatic about this, and we're going to take the necessary steps, and we're going to get it done. That doesn't mean we're not going to hold people accountable. We're going to hold them accountable, but we're going to understand the process that we have to use to get this thing done. Or we're going to go ahead and take our guns to D.C. and start shooting. And then there's really no in-between ground there. You know, you're either going to use the process that we have to fix this the same way we got in the situation in the first place, or you're going to lead a violent revolution. And so I think that's what I really loved about, you know, Ron Paul, and especially even Rand Paul right now, because people are pissed off about what Rand is doing, but they don't understand the pragmatism that it takes to actually inspire and incite change. You know, if it was that easy, then we would never be in this situation in the first place, because Ron Paul doing what he was doing would have fixed everything, right? I mean, the guy's been in Congress for decades. So if it was that easy, then, you know, he would have already fixed it. So, you know, there's this idea of time and patience and pragmatism. And I think that if we all start teaching each other that, and having some patience and understanding the process and actually truly getting involved in the process, then we could actually see some pretty substantial gains. But unless that happens, I hate to be a pessimist, you know, but I think that, you know, we're in trouble here, because we can't unite the party, because, like I said, the Libertarian fraction wants it today. Actually, they want it yesterday. And it's not that I don't want it yesterday. I definitely do. But, you know, I understand the pragmatism that it takes to get something done. And then, you know, you've got the Republican establishment, who's, you know, you might as well call them Democrats. So we're obviously fighting them, but we're fighting Libertarians too, and we're fighting Tea Party. So we're all fighting each other. You know, so it's going to take some pragmatism and understanding how to work with each other, and working with each other on issues that we agree with, and on issues that we don't agree with. There's no need to argue about it, because we're not going to change it anyways. So if it's something we can't agree on, then just shut up about it and let's not talk about it anymore, you know? But
Well, I appreciate that. I think what we will see is a lot of people actually running for office, particularly, you know, our generation. You know, the people that have been serving since, you know, Nixon was in office, they've got to go. So, you know, eventually who's going to replace them? And I think we will see an uptick in people, especially libertarian-leaning or liberty-minded individuals, a lot of veterans that are very angry with what has taken place in American politics, and the wars they've been sent off to are definitely going to be running for office as well. Well, thank you so much. It was a very interesting interview, and I hope we can speak again in the future. If you want to check out Michael's work, you can follow him on Twitter. If you want to support the 10th Amendment Center, you can go to 10thamendmentcenter.com. Thank you so much, Michael.
take care. Have a good one.
Thanks.